I've never seen this before. In case that you haven't been doing. So he took it out and explained to me where it is. It's, we're screwed up again. It's I've never seen this before. It's a singer Swedish.
Welcome. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Gabriela Tafoya, Professor of Political Science at Manchester University, and two students who are participants in the Model United Nations. And the students will introduce themselves. Professor Tafoya is here for the second time. We heard from her last spring where she shared her life experiences and the things that brought her to study and to teach political science. Her primary fields of teaching are Latin American politics, global social policy, environmental policy, specifically with a focus on gender inequality, poverty, and social rights. The subject this time, and you certainly will be introducing it, but the subject for the Model United Nations this time is homeless at home, the crisis of internally displaced persons. Professor Tafoya.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for being here tonight. Sorry? It's good. It's good. Instead of me I'm always speaking, right? I'm going to let my students introduce themselves first, and then I will talk a little bit about our challenge that we participated in this last fall, and then I'll turn back to the students to talk about their experiences, and we'd welcome questions at any time during our presentation. So here are Cade and Miriam, our star Model United Nations delegates.
Yeah, hello. My name is Cade McAleese. I'm a senior at Manchester University. I'll be graduating this year. I'm a history major and a political science minor.
I'm Miriam Nofsinger-Erbaugh. I am a sophomore, and I am double majoring in peace studies and political science with minors in environmental studies and international studies.
They make my job so easy. All right, so I'm the faculty advisor to the Model United Nations program at Manchester. And what that means is that these students take a class/club with me. So we prepare a lot of topics in international politics, global issues, things that are going on around in the world right now. And so they research these problems, and we attend a conference that changes location every fall. This past fall, we went to the University of Louisville in Kentucky. And they represent countries from the United Nations Security Council, and they debate these international issues and try to come up with their peers with resolutions, a path forward to resolve some of these issues. And this year was really special because the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees issued a global challenge to all Model United Nations organizations around the world to think really hard about the issue of internally displaced peoples. And so all our students were encouraged to focus on this issue and write resolutions to deal with the myriad of problems that IDPs face. And the best resolutions are going to be read by the High Commissioner and possibly implemented into policy. So this is a very exciting opportunity for students around the world to participate in real-time policy making on an international level. So I want to give you a little bit of background about internal displacement, and then I'll turn it back over to our friends here. And this is a picture of our team. We had 15 people at the conference last fall. Okay, so again, this was a global challenge that was issued by the UN Refugee Agency. Internally displaced peoples are those that have been displaced from their home due to a variety of reasons: violent conflict, natural disasters, all kinds of issues, but they have not crossed a border into another country, right? So most people are familiar with refugees and refugee crises around the world, right? Migrants at the US border, migrants crossing the Mediterranean very precarious ways to get to Europe from Northern Africa. However, IDPs are more than double the number of refugees around the world. So they are homeless within their own home country. And a lot of times their governments are unable, sometimes unwilling, to help them with the same things that refugees need: shelter, food, medicine, etc. So IDPs, for short, for internally displaced peoples, was just one of the 4 topics that the challenge was about, but it was the one that our conference chose to focus on. Okay, so like I was saying before, right, IDPs are people who have been forced to flee their homes because of persecution, conflict, violence, or disasters, but have yet to cross an international border. Because they are within their home country, right, they remain citizens of their country, but they don't have all the international legal protections that refugees have under the Refugee Convention. Right, they can invoke their rights as citizens and claim assistance to their government, but they don't have that special status that refugees have that trigger international aid, international assistance by the UN and other countries. IDPs account for 60% of people that are forced to flee their homes. And in the future, we unfortunately expect this number to go even higher as climate change and ongoing conflicts continue to exacerbate or drive internal displacement. So some numbers at a glance. Like I said before, most people are familiar with refugees or the problems around refugees, and these figures are from 2021 to 2022. Refugees numbered about 32.5 million worldwide in mid-2022, while IDPs, people displaced within their own countries, numbered over 100 million. And so where are most IDPs located? Where are the countries where there are large concentrations of internally displaced peoples? And these figures are from 2021. Syria, with the ongoing civil war there, has seen the largest numbers of IDPs, almost 7 million. Colombia, with their long civil war, even though there has been a peace agreement between guerrilla groups and the government, there's still about 6.5 million people still displaced in Colombia. Democratic Republic of the Congo is next. Yemen, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Sudan, Somalia, and South Sudan are the rest of the countries on that list. And what's not included here is the increasing number of internally displaced peoples in Gaza right now, as well as in Ukraine, right? Those two conflicts have skyrocketed the number of internally displaced peoples. Early last year, Ukraine was topping the list of countries with the highest concentration of IDPs. But since then, about 5 million Ukrainians have been successfully relocated outside of the country. Successfully is not the best word, but they're in a safer place. And so we expect that this year, Gaza will be the place where there's the highest concentration, unfortunately. Okay, so why does this matter? Obviously, there's a lot of IDPs, more than 100 million. And again, although they're still legally under the jurisdiction of their government, they don't have access to a lot of their basic needs, right? And so a lot of humanitarian assistance is needed to help them, but a lot of the time their own governments are the biggest barrier to getting humanitarian assistance. And this population is less visible politically, internationally, because a lot of the focus is on refugees in the news. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say about IDPs, and we welcome any questions you may have. And just to mention, next fall, we are traveling to IU Kokomo for our conference there. And it is my hope that one day we'll have the conference right here at Manchester. If we can find a place for 75 students to stay for a weekend, we'll see. I'm working on that. Maybe in a couple of years I can figure it out. But I want to turn over to our students now. I have a couple questions for them to get the conversation going, but we'd love to hear any questions that you may have. And so the first question I had for them was to talk a little bit about generally what Model UN is like. What are the things that we do? What is the UN Security Council? And then we can talk about their experience at the conference last year.
Well, Model UN, it's a lot of prep work. That's what I'll say. You kind of have to get in the mindset of whatever country you're going to represent. I represented Ghana, so I had to know a lot about Ghana and what their stance on these conflicts that we were talking about were. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff that goes into it.
Yeah, so in Model UN, we are sort of imitating the model of the UN Security Council, which has, I'm blanking on the number, how many? 15 countries that sit on it. You've got the permanent 5, who are essentially the winners of World War II. And then you have other countries that rotate on and off. And so we meet together as students, sort of assign the roles of the different representatives of countries, and then discuss issues in the same way that they might discuss that on the UN Security Council. So I was Great Britain, so I was preparing a lot to vote in the way that Great Britain would vote on these issues and not argue from my perspective, but argue from the perspective of Great Britain.
I just wanted to mention something about the UN Security Council. So the UN is a huge organization, right? And it has a lot of different parts. The United Nations Security Council's specific job is to maintain peace and security, right? That's a very broad mandate, and there are a lot of ways that they try to do that. But this is the subcommittee, I guess, of the United Nations, the body that deals with international conflicts, right? When there's a conflict going on that poses a threat to international security broadly, they discuss what to do about it, right? And so they have a lot of tools at their disposal. Peacekeepers, right? They can send actual troops into conflict areas. But most of the time before we get there, there's a lot of diplomatic talks that go on, right? Trying to get opposing parties to the table for a conversation about how to resolve conflicts. A lot of what they do is organize humanitarian aid. What else do I want to say about the UN Security Council? Resolutions are a big way that the Security Council functions. Resolutions are pretty much a statement, right? That the member states draft and vote on to approve. And essentially, it's kind of stating the position of the council on a particular topic. And so one huge example of this is the Security Council passed a resolution saying that Jewish people had the right to have a state. The next day, Israel declared its independence, right? And the state of Israel was created. So the UN Security Council has been hugely influential in some ways, but it also has a lot of limitations. Like Miriam said, the 5 permanent members are the United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. And you can imagine that sometimes they have a hard time agreeing on international policy. And as permanent members, they have veto power. So if one of those 5 countries does not like what's written in a resolution, if they don't like a decision that the council as a whole wants to make, it doesn't happen, right? And so they have a lot of power to act or not act in international conflicts. And so there's a lot of bargaining and a lot of talking that goes on. And that's what the students try to replicate, right? They do a simulation acting as if they were a representative from that country. Okay.
I will add that the P5 members have sort of 3 options. They can vote yes, they can veto it, but they can also abstain, which becomes important. Recently, we've seen with the conflict in Gaza that the US had sort of vetoed several different resolutions about humanitarian aid and a humanitarian pause. And then eventually it was allowed to pass, not because the US voted for it, but because they chose to abstain. It's a way of not holding it back, but not being put on record as agreeing for it.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how the conference was for you guys, especially with this IDP issue, which was a little bit different than most of our other conference meetings.
We were in the same conference, right? Okay, that's cool. Yeah, so there were multiple councils when we went. We all got divided up. And Miriam and I were actually in the same council. You were UK, correct? Okay. So yeah, there were like 4 or 5 different councils, and we were all debating on things. And obviously, like we said, we had to represent a country and their position. But when we started doing the IDP stuff, it was kind of like all those walls were torn down, and it was just all of us trying to figure out the best way to deal with the IDP situation. So I thought that was interesting. It was kind of like a turn or a flip on its head of the whole Security Council thing.
Yeah, so when we went into that conversation, we were no longer representing our countries. That was not what the High Commissioner had asked us to be doing. So it was interesting, as Cade was saying, because it was about halfway through the conference, and we had just come from like discussing Russia, Ukraine, and these super intense issues. And you can imagine having a representative of Russia. It is very difficult to discuss that issue. And so I appreciated the IDP issue because we were able to take a pause and work together in a different way. It also forced me to educate myself a lot about this issue. You run into very different issues when you are an internally displaced person as to when you are a refugee. And so we talked a lot about providing aid, but respecting the sovereignty of the country that these people are in. And that is a really difficult line to walk. That is a line that the UN constantly struggles with. And then additionally, we talked a lot about like very specific issues that they might run into, such as registration. Refugees are registered in different ways. Many internally displaced people may have had their homes destroyed or have had things happen that they no longer have their vital government documents. And so they sort of lose all paper trace of their existence. And so they lose their voice in a democratic system, and often having that ID of some sort is a way that they could connect with government aid, but they've lost it. And so there were a lot of convoluted specifics of this issue that I was able to learn about through this discussion.
Talk a little bit about representing your particular countries, right? We can all, we all know that there are some countries that are more powerful than others in international politics, right? The US has a lot of weight, and what the US wants carries a lot of weight. Other big players, Russia, China. So what is it like to represent a smaller country, a less powerful country, such as Ghana, and then a middle power like the UK? What is the approach, or what can these countries get done next to, countries like the US and Russia?
Yeah, so with the P5 countries, they kind of have a lot of pull, a lot of power in the Security Council. Like we mentioned before, they can veto things. So if they don't like a certain word on the resolution or a way things are phrased, they can just veto that, and you gotta restart the resolution, or it might be too late. It might not even get passed. And so it's kind of the role of these smaller countries to sort of try to get these bigger countries to work together. Maybe not like necessarily agree on an issue, but like come to some sort of conclusion. If it is just as little as like providing financial aid, or it might be something bigger. It is sort of the role of these smaller countries to sort of be like the intermediaries, try to work with the P5 in order to like get something done, get some sort of resolution passed.
And then the UK has an interesting position because it is a P5 member, so it has this veto power, but it is also not Russia or China or the US that has such a huge pull in global politics. A lot of what Great Britain does is they follow what the US is saying on certain things. But what is really interesting is the places in which they differentiate themselves. For instance, again, on the conflict between Israel and Gaza, the UK has been calling for humanitarian aid even when the US was against it. And so a lot of what the UK does is mimicking what it sees done by its ally in the US, but I think it still plays a pivotal role because it can echo in a slightly less aggressive manner, at least in our council, some of the things that the US says, and has a little more respect. Feels like maybe too strong of a word, but it has a little bit more of a draw with some of the smaller countries, as well as with maybe Russia or China, which is just not going to listen to anything the US says in a lot of these debates.
And we've said a few times that the US didn't do this or didn't do that with respect to the Israel-Hamas conflict. And it has a lot to do with the position of the US as an ally to Israel, right? And so it's not that the US delegation in the Security Council was not pro-humanitarian assistance for those people that have been displaced and are caught in the middle of this conflict. It's that some countries wanted a stronger wording in the resolution arguing for a ceasefire or an all-out end to the conflict. And the US, not alone, right? There are other countries that felt they could not make such a demand on Israel because the position of Israel is that it is defending itself from a terrorist organization in Hamas, right? And so it can get very complicated, right? It's not black and white at all. There are a lot of things to consider. And I think we can say that the entire Security Council is concerned with the displacement of the Palestinian population and a humanitarian crisis slash disaster that it has turned into. We'd love to get some questions on either any of these issues or for the students.
I have one question before we pass it around. I read in the Oak Leaves, which is, for those of you who may not know, the university newspaper, that your team had several awards, peer awards. I just wondered whether you would like to share something about that.
Everyone in my team is an award winner in my heart. The conference has this award system that I really like because it is peer-based. So there are multiple councils going on at the same time, right? So they're meeting, I think we had 5 councils last time independently, right? So they're all doing the same thing, but in their own little worlds. And at the end, each council votes on best delegate, best delegate. Oh, it's best delegate first, second, and third place. And then most in character. And then best representative overall, best like conference participation overall. So there's a bunch of awards. And I'm not very competitive, but I'll say that in the 3 years that I've been leading this, we have won awards every year. I'm just joking, I'm very competitive. And this past year, we won Best Delegate, first place in one council for the representation of Russia. That was Sam Hupp. He couldn't join us today because he's doing theater. And yes, my students can have multiple things that they like. It's okay. And then we had another student win for representing Russia on a different council. And our third winner this past year represented the United States on another council. But I'm really proud of all of them, especially these 2.
Other questions?
I've been bothered for years that the P5 have veto power. I'm like, get over yourselves. Come on. Is there any loophole? Is there anything anywhere that the other countries could get around that or cause a change like an amendment?
I mean, the reality is not really, because you would have to get all 5 of those countries on board to not veto that amendment. So there's not really a loophole. It's about finding the exact wording that everyone can agree on. There is, within the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we didn't come to a resolution within our council. It was really ugly because in our specific council, the Russia representative would not pass any resolution that stated that that Ukraine was a country. And so they were denying the existence of the country and wouldn't allow any aid because the country didn't exist. It's part of Russia. So yeah, veto is a difficult thing to try and work around. And as frustrating as some of that can be, and as specific of countries that it gives power that might not even reflect more widely international politics now as opposed to at the end of World War II. I don't know that I foresee an easy path in which that will change, because why would they not want to be able to veto things?
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to that. The United Nations was founded after World War II, and it was designed to be a democratic institution. In the General Assembly, every country has a vote, right? Every country can speak their mind in the General Assembly. But of course, the 5 permanent members also wanted to retain some of that power, and that's how the UN Security Council was designed, to have veto power. But it's not only in the United Nations Security Council that they have veto power, they also have that power in terms of the UN Charter. And so any amendment or change to the UN charter as a whole has to be approved by the permanent 5 members. And it's not that nothing has ever changed. The UN Security Council used to be even smaller, and it was expanded to 15 countries from 10 or 11, I don't remember exactly, several years ago, or a couple decades ago now. So there has been some change, and there's a constant movement for expanding the council a bit more. And some of the arguments pro or against that are, what's the point of having a small body that can act quickly? If it gets too big, it's not going to be able to act quickly anymore, right? Because there's just going to be like the General Assembly where almost nothing gets done. It's just deliberations. But why should the council membership be expanded, or maybe new permanent members, or maybe just no permanent members? The world has changed, right? There are a lot of countries that want a bigger say in these affairs. But like Miriam said, it would require the 5 permanent members to give up their power. And that's probably unlikely.
This is also something I'm interested in. So none of these countries have directly spoken about it, but we have seen in sort of recent history P5 members not wanting to give up their veto vote, specifically with issues of Russia and Ukraine. There's been a lot of countries that have called Russia to abstain because they're too involved. And similarly, with the US being aligned with Israel, there's been countries that have called for the US to abstain from votes, and neither of those countries really have. And so while they've not directly said anything about it, the trend and their voting otherwise shows that they don't really want to give up that power.
Yeah, I'd be interested in some comments and observations on how many other faculty members and which courses they teach would a Model UN student take, and how much is the other faculty involved in this whole enterprise? It's not an easy answer, but it just like some observations.
You need this.
Well, in the last 3 years since I started at Manchester, it's been a one-woman show. But I've tried to include my colleagues as much as possible. We have a new professor in the Peace Studies program, Dr. Anuj Gurung, and he is very interested in these issues. And so I've invited him to join the Model United Nations program more informally than formally, because there's a lot of red tape with, who gets paid to do what, and it's under my department in political science. But he's helping me in kind of preparing materials for the students, but it's my hope that he's going to be more active in the next year. This semester, I'm teaching a class called Comparative Foreign Policy, and we are having a simulation similar to what we do in Model United Nations for our final project. And I've invited Dr. Gurung to come and serve as the chair of the council. So I've been preparing with the students, and he'll be kind of, a fresh set of eyes in seeing how they operate in the council. And I'm really looking forward to that. One thing that I'm really excited about, so let me back up. Before I started at Manchester, Dr. Onieji ran the Model United Nations program since the 1990s. And they had a different system. They were going to the National Harvard Model UN program, which is really exciting. People from all over the world, students from all over the world come. It's about 3,000 students participating in various simulations, not just the UN Security Council, but the General Assembly and other bodies of the UN. However, it's in Boston in February, so weather is always an issue. The cost was a big issue. And so 3 years ago, I was faced with the decision of asking students to pay for most of it out of pocket or changing to a more local conference. And so we tried the local conference that's hosted by the Indiana Consortium for International Studies. And we really liked it. We really liked it because students actually were able to participate more fully. At the Harvard model, we're a small team. We're a small university. We were kind of on the sidelines, right? More listening to the teams from major universities. A university like Yale or Harvard has 50 people teams, right? And we were going with our 5 to 8 person teams. And so at the local conference, it's smaller, right? So every single one of our students is able to actually represent a country and speak and participate for the entire conference. And we also get the big countries, right? For the 3rd year in a row, we've gotten Russia. That's huge, right? That had never happened in the whole entire history of Model UN at Manchester before. We had to contend ourselves with just getting countries that are small and not unimportant, right? They have a role to play, but we could never dream of getting to represent the US or Russia or China. So the other thing that I really like about this conference is that we get to interact with peer institutions, right? So it's smaller universities from the Midwest that participate, and our students have been able to develop networks with, students that are kind of having the same experience as they are at a small liberal arts college. The next thing is that it's in the fall. It's in November, which makes it easier for us to arrange travel and all the logistics that go into it, but also it frees up our spring. And so we, for the last couple of years, have done a VIA at Manchester. Now we're here. But what we are planning for maybe starting next year, if I can get it together, is joining a Model European Union conference, which happens every spring at IU Bloomington. And so this would be similar to the Model UN conference, but simulating a meeting of the European Union, which I'm really excited about. Miriam's excited. Cade is going to graduate and leave us. But yeah, I don't remember the question anymore.
I expect that evidently the Security Council has agreed on some things through the years. Is there anything to be learned from that on areas that they could work together and maybe even get to know each other well enough that that could be a step toward a breakthrough there?
Well, most of the time when you see these like contentions among maybe like the P5 or in the Security Council, it's usually over like large, broad, like not broad topics, but like contentious topics like, the war in Israel or the war in Ukraine. And that's kind of where you see those, like them start to butt heads. For a lot of them, a lot of the problems that we talked about in the Model UN Security Councils, what was it? One was like Nigeria, like Niger, and then like some problems in Haiti. It's a lot easier to get people to agree on things in that with those events, just because they don't have like a huge stake in the event themselves. Like Miriam said, like the Russia-Ukraine thing was a nightmare to try to like get Russia to concede something, but. Yeah, it's a lot of those smaller ones is where a lot of the work gets done. But even on the bigger issues, a lot of the time, we can get some sort of humanitarian aid passed, even if it's not like a ceasefire like some countries want, or a continuation of the war or whatever. They get something done.
It's all about the language of things, and the UN Security Council does do stuff. We see peacekeeping missions in various areas, which is something that the Security Council authorizes. And we also see lots of different calls for humanitarian aid and different specific things that are helping people around the world. It's harder on those hot button issues that involve representatives that are on the Security Council. But ultimately, a lot of what the countries are fighting about are the specific languages, and like there was a point at which somebody in our council was like, well, if you include this word, then I'm going to veto X, Y, and Z on all these other resolutions that we've talked about. And so a lot of it is just about spending hours upon hours talking it through and getting to the point where we can agree and bargaining within that and saying, if we were to put this in or get rid of this one piece of language, would you not veto it because we say this elsewhere that you're angry about?
Yeah, and there is certainly plenty that does get done, right? There, like they said, there's a lot of missions around the world right now, led by the Security Council, and I think there's definitely a lot of inclusion of other countries in these other conflicts that are not involving one of the members of the Security Council, right? Or a major ally of one of the members of the Security Council. And so there's been a lot of movement towards kind of giving up power a little bit, right? In the last few decades, there have been so many blunders in humanitarian assistance, and all of the acts of genocide that have happened in many different places where the international community didn't act quickly enough or didn't do the right thing. And so because of all these criticisms over the last few decades, the council has actually opened up to other countries leading some of these missions or providing the staff for some of these missions, right? So, for example, we still have a mission in South Sudan. I am not a member of the UN Security Council. And that's led mostly by forces from the African continent, right? We don't need to have Western, European, American leadership in every single situation like it used to be for the most part, right? So yeah, things get done. I think one of the things that I'm really interested in seeing how it gets resolved and trying to follow it closely is what's happening in Haiti right now. I don't know how many of you know, but the country has no government. Gangs are in charge, right? Literally, gangs are in charge, and the international community is observing this building humanitarian crisis. And what do we do? Do we engage in a conversation with criminal organizations to get humanitarian aid in? Do we violate that country's sovereignty by essentially invading it and rooting them out? What do we do, right? Do we set up a government that the West approves of, but the gangs don't, and negotiate with them? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. And so that's kind of one of those really tough cases where even if all 15 members of the Security Council agree on what should be done, it's going to be very hard to do anything. Other questions?
I was wondering about how the schools, I think you said there were 15 different schools that came to this Model UN. How is it determined which students or schools will be assigned which countries, and do the students get to choose a little bit, or is it mandated somehow?
So I said that one day I want it to be at Manchester, and that I'm also already having nightmares about that one day because it's a very big logistic, organizational, administration issue. So we had 15 councils. No, we didn't have 15 councils. We have 15 member councils. We had 5 councils last time. And I want to say we had 5 universities. So Manchester, University of Louisville, IU, Kokomo did not participate last year, but they usually participate. IU Southeast. Who else was there? I want to say there another university from Kentucky. But I think there were 5 of us. And so this organization, the Indiana Consortium for International Studies, hosts the conference. And so all the universities pay dues to this organization, and they pay for most of the conference fees. And it used to be a larger group. It used to be more than 15 universities from Indiana and surrounding areas, but COVID kind of slashed it. And so we're building back up. My first year, there were only 3 universities participating. Last year, we had 5. And Kokomo wasn't able to participate, would have made 6. But we're trying to build up our membership again. And so how does the choosing happen? That's another reason I really like this conference, is that our students do get some choice. The way it works is I send them how many students I have and what countries they would like, right? A list of countries. Maybe we'd really like this one. And, I send as many as my students want. If they want 5 different countries, that's what we send and hope for the best. And the way that it works is that there's an organizational committee made up of 3 professors from the participating universities, and they make those decisions. So they try to be really fair in divvying up the prime countries, right? They make sure every university gets at least one of their top choices. But because there are multiple councils going on at the same time at the conference, we can get multiples of the same country. So we had 3 Russias, 3 United States, 2 United States, 3 Ghana, 1 Malta, 2 UK, and 2 Albania, right? And so I like this model because the students can work together in a team to prepare their materials and, come up with their arguments and their positions on all of these different issues. But then when they go to the conference, they're separated into their individual councils and they get to, showcase all the work that they've done. And so we do get some choice. We don't get everything we want, but every year so far, we've been pretty lucky in getting a lot of what we want.
There are also student moderators for each simulation. So sort of more experienced students, often from the host school, have the opportunity to not represent a country, but to moderate. And so they get experience there as well.
Yeah, oftentimes graduate students from the bigger universities serve as chair of the councils, and that gives them, a different level of experience. They're the ones, calling on countries or cutting them off sometimes, which can be really challenging. And I'm hope that my students will come back and do part of that in the next few years.
Any other questions? I would like to thank Professor Tafoya, Caden, and Miriam for what you've shared with us and the challenge, obviously, that's been for you and a challenge for us in understanding what you're doing. Our program for May is with Dr. Kimberly Pike, who is a professor of nutrigenomics, one of the health science programs at the Fort Wayne campus. And I certainly encourage you to come again. Thank you.